Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. So today I want to talk about one of the lesser known and slightly uncomfortable stories in Bronte history. One that tends to sort of sit quietly in the background but becomes difficult to ignore once you really look at it. This video is about Branwell Bronte and the long-standing suggestion that while he was working away from Haworth as a tutor, he may have fathered a child. Before we go any further, I want to be very clear about what this video is and what it isn't. There is no surviving letters in which Branwell admits this outright, and there is no baptismal records that name him as the father. What we are dealing with here, at least, is careful historical research, fragments of evidence and informed speculation. The work that prompted this video comes from Juliet Barker, particularly her book The Brontës, you know, that big famous one the size of a brick, which I don't know where I've put it now, but we all love it anyway. She is the one who's done the detailed archival work, and I want to be clear that the idea and the possibilities I'm exploring today come from her research. After reading this section in her book, I felt I had to share it with you and talk it all through, because once you see the evidence laid out, it raises some very difficult and interesting questions. I've also spent some time looking into the details myself and asking my own questions and trying to piece together what might have happened. There's a lot that isn't certain, and that uncertainty does kind of open up even more possibilities, but we need to explore it. This isn't about scandal and it isn't about judging Branwell. It's about placing him in his own time, understanding the pressures he was under and looking honestly at what might have happened during that short but crucial period of his life. So in this video, we're going to look at where Branwell was in his life at that point, what he was doing and why his time away from Haworth matters. And then we're going to carefully examine the evidence that suggests he may have fathered a child. So grab yourself a brew and let's begin by placing Branwell in Broughton and Furness in 1840. In 1840, Branwell Bronte took up a position as a private tutor in the small town of Broughton in Furness. And I'm going to just call it Broughton because it's too much of a mouthful. I've forgotten what I was going to say now. Oh yeah, he was employed by William Postlethwaite, what a great name, to educate his two sons. Now, this role was meant to give Branwell something he desperately wanted: an income of his own, independence from Haworth, and the space to pursue his writing alongside his teaching. He remained in this position for only about 6 months, but it is a crucial period in his life and one that often gets overlooked. When Branwell began working in Broughton, his situation was quite different from that of his sister, and I think it's really important to understand this. At this point, his younger sister Anne was working as a governess, as we know, and like most governesses of that time, she lived within the house of her employers. That was very normal. That meant very little privacy and very little freedom. Branwell's arrangement, however, was very different. He didn't live with the family. Instead, he was lodging separately at a place called High Sky House, and his work as a tutor required him to be with the Postlethwaite boys for only a certain amount of hours each day. Outside of those working hours, his time was largely his own, and that must have felt incredibly freeing. I mean, for most of his life, Branwell had been living at the parsonage in Haworth. I mean, he shared his space with his father, his 3 sisters, the 2 servants, and obviously a steady stream of parishioners and curates. Privacy was limited and independence even more so. But in Broughton, he suddenly had room to breathe. He walked extensively through the surrounding countryside, particularly in the Southern Lake District, often carrying a copy of Wordsworth's sonnets with him. He explored the landscape on foot, attended services at local chapels, and spent long stretches of time reading and thinking. I mean, this was not passive wandering. He was engaged deeply with the place he was moving through. He also recorded his impressions. Branwell noted travel books with his own observations, sometimes agreeing with the author and sometimes correcting them, which tells us a great deal about his confidence and his belief about his opinions and that they had value. Alongside all of this, he continues to write. And during this period, Branwell works on a sonnet to Black Combe, the mountain that sort of dominates the landscape around the Broughton estuary. Black Combe is a striking presence in that part of the country, and it's visible for miles, and it's clearly made this lasting impression on him. Writing about it allowed Branwell to place himself, imaginatively at least anyway, within the same poetic traditions as the late poets he admired. He also revised a long narrative poem called Sir Henry Tunstall. And this poem tells the story of a man returning home after many years away, only to find that he no longer fits into the life he left behind. And it's hard not to notice how closely this theme mirrored Branwell's own concerns about belonging, purpose, and the future. At the same time, he was translating the works of Horace, a Roman poet whose writing was considered a serious test of classical learning. Translating was not a casual exercise. I mean, it was a way of demonstrating discipline, education, and literary skills. And Branwell was trying to show that he could measure up. He also began once again to reach out to established literary figures, hoping for feedback and guidance. This wasn't the behaviour of someone drifting or disengaged. It was the behaviour of someone who still believed that a literary career might be possible. Ow. And this is the key point I really want to underline. This period at Broughton comes before Branwell's relationship with Mrs. Robinson and before the drinking becomes a dominating force in his life. We're not looking at Branwell at his lowest point here. We're looking at a version of Branwell who is engaged, hopeful, ambitious, and still very much trying. That's what makes what happens next so significant, because whatever caused his sudden dismissal, it came at a moment when things, at least outwardly, appeared to be moving in a really positive direction. While working as a tutor away from home, Branwell continued to take his writing seriously, and he began to sort of reach out beyond his immediate circumstances. He sent poems and classical translations to two writers he admired, Thomas de Quincey and Hartley Coleridge. I mean, these were not casual choices. De Quincey was already well known for his essays and his literary criticism, and Hartley Coleridge, the son of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, was himself a respected poet and thinker. For Branwell, being read by men like this meant being taken seriously as a literary mind, not just as a young man writing in isolation. Thomas de Quincey never replied, but this was likely due to health rather than indifference. I mean, at this point in his life, poor de Quincey was suffering from long-term illness, exhaustion, and effects of laudanum dependency, which often led him unable to keep up with his correspondences. A lack of response would have been a disappointment, but it's kind of not unusual for him. Whereas Hartley Coleridge, however, did reply, and his response mattered enormously. Hartley was living at Nab Cottage on the shores of Rydal Waters in the Lake District, a place deeply associated with the romantic literary world that Branwell admired. Even more remarkable, he invited Branwell to visit him there. Of course, Branwell went at once, why would he not? And he spent the day with Coleridge reading his work out loud, discussing poetry and talking seriously about literature. This was no small thing. For the first time, Branwell was sitting with an established writer who treated him as an intellectual equal, someone he respected, who listened carefully to his ideas and engaging with his writing, not dismissing it or patronising it. It must have felt like confirmation that his ambitions were not foolish. Encouraged by this experience, Branwell decided to take on an ambitious classical project, translating the first book of Horace's Odes. This was a demanding task, requiring not only a strong grasp of Latin, but also the ability to carry Horace's precision and his rhythm and wit into this English verse. Classical translations were seen as a serious scholarly achievement, and Branwell clearly believed that completing such a work would earn him genuine literary respect, the kind that went beyond family praise or private circulation. Hartley Coleridge even promised to look over the translation once it was finished, which would have felt like a real opportunity, a possible doorway into wider recognition. Yet, only a few weeks later, everything changed. Branwell was suddenly dismissed from his tutoring position. Traditional explanations have often pointed to neglect of the pupils or excessive drinking, but these ideas don't sit comfortably with the evidence. I mean, at this stage, there is no clear sign that Branwell's drinking had reached the level that we often associate with his later years, and there is no indication that his teaching ability had abruptly collapsed. In fact, Branwell had strong reasons to hold on to this job. He enjoyed the independence it gave him, he earned his own money, he managed his own time, and living a life that allowed space for reading and writing. Leaving it meant returning to Haworth and to dependency on his family once again. I mean, it seems unlikely that he would have risked all of that through carelessness. The real reason for his dismissal remains unclear, but what is certain is that it came at a moment when Branwell had just begun to feel recognised and encouraged. The timing could hardly have been more painful. So, at this point, we need to introduce a new figure because the source of this idea really matters. Richard Monckton Milnes, who later became Lord Houghton, was a poet, a biographer and a literary historian. He moved in the same circles as many sort of major Victorian writers, and he had a particular interest in literary lives and private correspondences. He was also someone who had access to papers that most people never saw. In 1858, Milnes was shown a group of Branwell Bronte's letters. I mean, these letters had been written years earlier to John Brown, the sexton at Haworth. John Brown himself had died several years before this point, and it appears that the letters were shown to Milnes by John Brown's brother, who had retained them. I mean, this is important because it means the letters were still in private hands, not as part of any official archive. Among these letters was one written by Branwell while he was living and working in Broughton. Branwell had apparently asked that this particular letter should not be shared. Despite that, Milnes made a partial transcript of it for his own records. Crucially, the most striking part does not come from the letter itself. Underneath his transcript, Milnes added a separate note in his own hand. In that note, he wrote that Branwell had left the Postlethwaite household having had a natural child by one of the daughters or servants, and that the child had died. So we need to be very clear here. We do not know whether the letter explicitly states this, or whether Milnes believes the letter implied it, or whether this was additional information given to him verbally by the person who showed him the correspondence, John Brown's brother. Milnes does not explain his source for his claim. It is in his annotations, not Branwell's written confession. This distinction matters. I mean, what we're left with then is a serious literary figure recording something he believed to be true, but without explaining how he knew this. This does not make the claim false, but it does mean it has to be handled with care. If Milnes' note is accurate, it offers a very different explanation for Branwell's sudden dismissal. Because in a respectable household, particularly one employing a tutor for their sons, an illegitimate pregnancy would have been a major scandal. Even the suggestion of such behaviour could have led to immediate dismissal, not as a punishment, but as a way of protecting the family's reputation. It also helps explain something else that has often been overlooked. When Branwell was dismissed from Thorpe Green many years later, he gave multiple, sometimes contradictory, explanations for what had actually happened. After Broughton, however, it appears to have been unusually quiet. I mean, there's no long defence, no dramatic account, no attempt to justify himself. That silence raises questions. Was this because he was in a steadier state of mind at this point in his life? Or was it because he wanted to keep the reason for his departure hidden? If there'd been a private scandal, silence may have been the only option available to him. I mean, none of this can be proven beyond doubt, but it does suggest the story of Branwell's time in Broughton may be more complex than the traditional explanations allow. Rather than carelessness or collapse, we may be looking at an event that forced him out suddenly and quietly, and one that had strong reasons never to be discussed openly. It's starting to get dark really early tonight, so as this video carries on, you might see the light changing quite a bit. I have the dog in with me, and even he can't be bothered to move. He's curled up in his bed just down here, fast asleep. Very muddy, because it's mud season, isn't it? Once the possibility of a child is raised, the obvious question is who the mother might have been. Now, Juliet Barker carefully examines several candidates using parish records, census returns and local geography rather than speculation, and it's brilliant. The name that tends to appear first in any discussion is Margaret Fish. Now, she was the young daughter of Branwell's landlord at High Sky House. She's often simply assumed because Branwell mentions her admiringly in a letter and because she was young, local and visible to him on a daily basis. But when the records are checked, the case quickly weakens. Margaret remains living with her family, unmarried and without children, well into the 1840s. There is no sign of a pregnancy, a birth, or a child who later disappears. Unless a baby dies immediately and unrecorded, which would be very unusual, she's an unlikely candidate. The Postlethwaite family themselves can be ruled out as there was no daughters in the household. So that leaves the most socially vulnerable group in any large house at that time, the servants. In the parish of Broughton and Furness, 3 unmarried women gave birth to illegitimate children during that relevant period. All 3 baptisms were recorded by the assistant curate Robert Pearson, which allows us to place them quite precisely in time. The first is Eleanor Nelson, whose son James was baptised in August 1840. Eleanor was very young, she was only 19 in the 1841 census and lived at Sky House, the cottages between Broughton House and High Sky House. Her brother was employed as a male servant at Broughton House, making it likely that Eleanor herself also worked there. However, the dates do not sit comfortably. For James to have been Branwell's child, conception would have had to occur almost immediately after Branwell arrived, which would have made him a very quick worker, and the child appeared to have been born early. So, while not impossible, it kind of messes with that timeline a bit. The second possibility is Frances Atkinson, who gave birth to a daughter, also named Frances, in December 1840. She was 17 at the time and is listed in the 1841 census as a female servant, though not living in her employer's house. Her address places her on the road between Broughton House and High Sky House, suggesting she may have worked for either family. However, her daughter survives into adolescence, dying at the age of 13. So this doesn't match what Lord Hornson's note said, that the child died, nor the implication that the death occurred relatively early. The third woman, Agnes Riley, is the most compelling candidate. She was 21 years old and the daughter of an agricultural labourer, living at Sunnybank in Broughton West. Her daughter Mary was born in February 1841, meaning the child was conceived in May 1840, precisely when Branwell was living and working in Broughton. Mary then disappears entirely from the record, which strongly suggests she died in infancy. Agnes later married, moved away from the area and eventually emigrated to Australia with her new family, none of whom appears to have known that she even bore a child before marriage. There's some other small details that gives us pause for thought. The name Mary was one Branwell used repeatedly in his early work, and while this alone doesn't prove anything, it adds to the sense of personal connection. It's also easy to imagine that for Agnes, leaving the area offered a way to escape local memory and lasting damage to her reputation, something which would have been extremely difficult for any unmarried mother in a small rural community. I mean, none of this allows us to state anything with certainty. I mean, there's no document that names Branwell as the father and no surviving correspondence that confirms the relationship. But with the parish records, the census returns, Lord Horton's famous little note, and a later poem that Branwell wrote are all considered together, Agnes Riley's case fits the evidence more closely than any other. What emerges is not proof, but a pattern, one that helps us understand why Branwell's departure from Broughton may have been far quieter and far more carefully handled than his later dismissal from Thorpe Green. Oh, I'm really warm. Anyway, as I mentioned before, Branwell later wrote a poem that some think may connect with the possibility that this Agnes Riley bore a child by him. In April 1846, 6 years after his time in Broughton, he composes Epistle from a Father on Earth to his Child in Her Grave. By this point in his life, Branwell had already endured the heartbreak of his attachment to Mrs. Robinson at Thorpe Green. I mean, that episode had left him in a very troubled state. He was beginning to drink more heavily and was struggling with depression and a profound sense of disappointment. So it is entirely possible that in writing this poem, he was looking back over his life, over his hopes and his losses and the decisions that he'd made, and maybe questioning how he'd arrived where he was. I mean, we've got to remember this was not a young man in his early 20s at this point. He wasn't carefree and ambitious. This was a man now in his late 20s who had experienced setback and emotional pain and confusion about his place in the world. This poem reads very different from the earlier pieces or his classical translations that we have seen elsewhere. There is no invented landscapes or dramatic narrative. Instead, it feels deeply personal, a reflection on the absence of a child and the lasting ache of that absence. I mean, in the poem, Branwell addresses the child directly and speaks in terms that suggests a bond that was lost too soon. For example, if I had but held thee once, only once in my arms. I mean, these lines express a longing for a moment that never occurred, a parent's desire to hold a child that fate did not allow. Later he writes, I left thee here and time must seal the loss that neither world nor tear can heal. Here he acknowledges a permanent separation and a sorrow that cannot be eased by words or tears. It is quiet, restrained grief, not theatrical or exaggerated, but heavy and intimate. And while the poem is not explicit about circumstances, these lines read as the words of a father who's lost a child too early and who carries that loss within him. Taken together with Lord Horton's note about a child who died soon after birth, the emotional tone of the poem resonates with the possibility of a real personal loss. The poem does not describe or reflect Branwell's earlier freedom in Broughton. The emotional focus is on absence and memory and irretrievable time. The landscape and imagery serve the mood of solitude and reflection rather than celebration or exploration. I mean, we should, however, be careful in how we read such a piece. The poem does not prove that Branwell was writing about a specific child that he fathered. It might be imaginative or symbolic, but it focuses on a child taken too soon and on the father left with the weight of that absence. I mean, it makes it very different from his earlier work and lends emotional force to the scenario we've been considering. I mean, this poem is important, not just a piece of writing, but as a window into Branwell's state of mind in 1846. a time when he was wrestling with loss and disappointment and unresolved questions about his life and his relationships. It gives the story a very human dimension. It reminds us that Branwell was not only an aspiring writer, but also a man capable of profound emotional experiences, feeling joy, responsibility and a grief in a way that were intensely personal and mostly unrecorded elsewhere. What we can now ask, having laid all of this out, is a very simple but important question. How old might that child have been when she died? And we cannot know for certain, but when we put the evidence together, the picture becomes surprisingly narrow. So, if we're looking at Agnes Riley's child, Mary, we know that she was born on the 20th of February 1841. What is striking is how quickly she disappears from the records. She doesn't appear in the 1841 census, just taken a few months later in June, and there's no burial record that can be confidently identified, and no trace of her in any later census records. In a period when children who survived even a short time were usually baptised, and when surviving infants often appear at least once in official records, that silence matters. This strongly suggests that the child died very young, perhaps within weeks, perhaps only a few months. I mean, it's even possible that she was stillborn or died soon after birth, that formal records were never created. I mean, that would explain why she vanishes almost immediately and why later family members appear to have no knowledge of her existence at all. This also aligns with what Lord Horton's note said, which refers simply to a child who died with no indication of later childhood or survival. And it fits with the tone and the content of the poem that Branwell wrote years later. The poem does not speak of shared memories or of a child he knew and raised. Instead, it circles around absence and imagined closeness and a sense of loss without experience. I mean, the grief for something that existed briefly but left that permanent mark. If this is what happened, it also helps explain why there was no public reckoning, why there was no marriage, why the situation seemed to have been contained and then quietly forgotten. A pregnancy that ended quickly, a child who did not survive, a young woman who later moved on and married, could all pass beneath the surface of official records, especially if discretion was in everyone's best interest. So while we cannot say exactly how old the child was when she died, the evidence points in one direction. Not years, not even many months, but long enough for the loss to be real, and for Branwell, if he was the father, to carry it with him long after the event itself had faded from public view. This is where the story becomes quieter and more human. Not a scandal played out in records and court proceedings, but something private, something brief and unresolved. And perhaps that is why it surfaces only in fragments, in a note made many years later, in a poem written long after the moment had passed, and the sudden disappearance of a name from a page. Tea. Yes, gonna have my tea. I need it today. It's a horrible day outside. That is why I'm in my room. It's grey and misty and damp and just generally not very nice at all. So constant supply of tea. And today's mug is my knitting mug. I will show you if I can get it to focus on my mug, not on me. Yeah, it looks like a knitted jumper, so it's very cosy and I like that. And it's not as big as my usual mugs, I must admit, but it has good qualities. It has a very quirky handle. It makes me think of an ear. Don't know if you can see that. Oh, does it look like an ear, this bit here? So yeah, tea. I have drunk a fair amount of it this winter. It seems to be my fuel. If in doubt, have a cup of tea. Tired? Have a cup of tea. Got something to do? Have a cup of tea. It's been, yeah. One of the most striking questions is, why was Branwell not made to marry the mother? I mean, in the early Victorian period, marriage was often the accepted outcome when a pregnancy occurred, particularly if the father was known. I mean, Branwell was not a casual labourer or a passing stranger. He was the son of a clergyman, and he was educated and articulate and, at that point, in paid employment. If Agnes Riley was the mother, she later went on to marry and build a new life, which suggests she was not considered socially irredeemable. There was, on the surface, no obvious reason why a marriage should not have taken place. So, did no one know, or was the matter kept quiet deliberately? Did Agnes want to conceal it, or was the decision made for her? The child may have died shortly after birth, before any pressure could be applied or any arrangements made. Agnes may have been quietly moved on, which was not unusual when a servant became pregnant. Or the situation may have been sort of deliberately contained to protect reputation on all sides, particularly those of the Postlethwaite household and of Branwell himself. The absence of a forced marriage is not proof of anything, but it is a telling silence. I mean, this brings us back to the letter. We know that Branwell wrote frequently and openly to John Brown, the sexton at Haworth, sharing details of his life that he didn't always share with his family. However, the surviving evidence suggests that the letter itself did not explicitly mention a child. The information about a natural child appears instead in the notes later written by good old Lord Horton, after he was shown the letters many years later by John Brown's brother. That raises another important question. Why did Lord Horton write that note at all? It does not read like a casual guess or a literary interpretation. It reads more like a record of something he'd been told. So, did John Brown know the story and share it with his brother? And did the brother in turn then recount it to Lord Horton during their conversation? If so, this then suggests the existence of an oral account that never made it to the written record, but obviously was remembered locally and passed on quietly. Then there is the question of who else might have known. Did Branwell's family know? I mean, did he even tell his sisters? There's no evidence that he did, and if he didn't, that silence is revealing in itself. And by the time these letters were seen in 1859, Patrick Bronte, he was still alive. But we don't know whether he was asked about them or whether the subject was considered sort of too sensitive to raise. Again, we're left with absence rather than confirmation. Even the name Agnes invites quiet speculation. Anne Bronte's novel, Agnes Grey, was published in 1847. But there's no evidence that Anne knew of Agnes Riley or knew anything of a possible connection to Branwell, and it may be just a pure coincidence. But in a family where names, experiences and observations often kind of filter through into their writing, it's difficult not to notice that overlap and at least ask that question. Taken together, these silences suggest something that was not shouted, recorded or resolved openly, but managed quietly and then left behind. I mean, if a child existed, even briefly, the consequences may not have been dramatic or public, but they may have lingered privately for years, shaping Branwell's thoughts, his regret, and perhaps the way he later looked back on his own life. In what is now Cumbria. I keep saying Crumbria. Cumbria. In 1840, Branwell Bronte took up pick up a penguin. Trying not to say that. I was trying to say something else. I was trying to say, yeah, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. Oops. 2 seconds while I get my notes. Because we all need notes sometimes, especially me. I need to prop them up so I can see them. It's one of those funny days today. I'm balancing. When I do videos, sometimes it all just stays there in my brain and I remember it. Other times, I struggle to remember things. So I have notes and I put them down here and I occasionally look down. I also find that, you know how I struggle with my words? Sometimes I have to spell them out so that I can say them better. Oops, something just fell over. So yeah, I have them there as well in my Kate language so that I can repeat them. Anywho, where were we? He was employed by William Postlethwaite. I'm going to get this right. Postlethwaite. Why is it? I have a video full of names I can't say. I have a little sheet here with all my ways to say them, but I still get confused. Try again. The poem does not prove that Branwell was writing about a specific child. And on the father, oh, come on. Is it even possible that she was stillborn or died so soon after birth that formal records were never created? Oh, you're scaring me, dog. Oh, Frankie, what you barking at? So, did Branwell Bronte have a child whilst at Broughton? We can't say for certain, but what we can say is that Juliet Barker's research provides a credible scenario that deserves consideration and exploring. And for me, this does not diminish Branwell. It humanises him. It places him in the real world, dealing with responsibilities, secrecy and loss, and reminds us that the Brontës were not only literary figures, but human beings with all the complexity that implies. I also want to give a big thank you to Juliet Barker, whose incredible research in her book, The Brontës, made this video possible. Without her meticulous work, we wouldn't have the clues and the insight even to begin to explore this fascinating story about Branwell. So I have my famous 3 questions for you today, and I'm sure I could have come up with 100 questions, to be honest, but let's try and stick with 3. So number 1, does this story convince you? Do you think Branwell fathered a child? Number 2, do you think the evidence is strong enough? And number 3, simply, what question comes up for you after hearing all of this? So please share your thoughts in the comments and let's keep this discussion going. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating and I can tell already that people are going to have a lot to say on the matter. So thank you again for watching today. If you like this video, please do that whole likey, subscribey, hypey thing because it really does help me out and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Bronte content. Have a great weekend and take care of yourselves, and I will see you all the Friday after next for more Bronte adventures. See you soon. Bye.